So welcome. Today's session is on developing emotional health in children with a life-threatening illness. And we are delighted to have with us Louise Webster. Louise has trained as both a child and adolescent psychiatrist and a paediatrician. And she's the clinical director of the Starship Paediatric Consultation Liaison Team, a child mental health team that works with children and adolescents who have significant medical and surgical conditions. Louise is also a senior lecturer in the Department of Psychological Medicine at the University of Auckland and teaches a number of undergraduate and postgraduate courses. Could you please make Louise welcome?
Well, good morning and thank you very much for inviting me. I'm always worried with a topic like this that, well, I kind of hope that most of what I'm going to say will be totally familiar to you, and the risk is that I'm kind of teaching you how to suck eggs, that you already know all that I'm going to talk about. Just so you're a little bit aware of my background, I trained in paediatrics first, and it was when I started working as a senior registrar in the chronic illness clinics. So I worked in the cystic fibrosis clinic and I worked in paediatric oncology in the diabetes clinic, that I got to hear families talking about having to chase their child with diabetes around the house to get them to have their insulin injections and things like that. So I gradually got more interested in how kids and families coped with having an ongoing illness. And the reality is that most young people cope, in fact, superbly. So I think the really important message to remember is that the majority of your young people are doing really well, and you don't need to hear anything I'm going to say. And that there are no specific emotional difficulties that are associated with cystic fibrosis. So there's nothing about a young person having cystic fibrosis that specifically is a problem. And in fact, there are very few well-researched specific interventions for kids with cystic fibrosis. But I guess the hard thing, and this has come from a number of studies, that having any chronic childhood illness does increase your risk of having emotional behavioural problems. It increases it about twofold. And that's the stress and strain of having an illness, and it increases the risk of all sorts of problems. So it increases the risk of anxiety, depression, ADHD, oppositional behaviour, all of those. So that's kind of across the board. So you can see from some of the really, this is fairly old research from the Isle of Wight, where they grabbed every single child on the Isle of Wight some years ago and subjected them to all sorts of questionnaires. And you can see that it kind of doubles from the rates of psychiatric disorder in kids in the general population to the kids with chronic illness. The children who are most at risk are the children who've got problems affecting their brain. So that's not the kids with cystic fibrosis. But as you all know far better than I do, CF is an incredibly demanding condition to manage, and your kids have to do, and you have to do, a whole lot of things that are really hard work every single day, day in and day out. So all of those take time, take effort, and they're a big demand on kids. There are also some things that kids have to do that are unpleasant, so blood tests, IVs, portacath access, those sorts of things, going into hospital. So kids with CF are subjected to a number of things that are really tough. And it requires great organisation and discipline, and that's potentially very stressful, because if you're spending hours of your day making your kid do things that they don't particularly want to do on some days, then it's very easy to feel like the balance of your day is shifted from having struggles with your child to being able to do nice stuff. And so, you know, when people like me talk about a kid being oppositional, when you look at studies in the community, I guess one of the hard things for children with any chronic illness is that a little bit of being oppositional goes a long way when there's tough stuff that you have to do every day. So the sorts of things that you see like that, you know, the kids whose first, last and middle word is no, that's fine for kids who don't have to do very much during their day, but for a child who's actually got to do physio and take enzymes, and they might have to do their nebulizers, then that's a lot of no's throughout the day. That's quite a struggle for everyone. I think also for kids who are a little bit anxious, then the sorts of things that have to happen for them also can make it really tough. So with all of the procedures and the hospital visits, those sorts of things, anxiety about needles and IVs, and no one likes having blood tests or likes having IVs or portacath accesses. Loss of usual routines, separation from family, all of those sorts of things, having to meet lots and lots of different people who wander into your hospital room and out, sometimes without a lot of explanation about who they are or what they're doing there, then that is quite a challenge for many kids. So again, a child who's a little bit anxious, where that wouldn't be a problem usually, that can make it much tougher for them if they have an illness like cystic fibrosis. Now, school is a time when you kind of really start to learn the stuff that's going to get you along in society. Well, actually, I take that back. I think the time when you really learn that to start with is fighting with your siblings. So when people say to me that their kids don't fight, I think, but how are they going to be prepared for life? So, in fact, by fighting with your siblings, you learn how to make peace and how to get on with people as well. So all sibling fighting is not a bad thing. But also when you get to school, you know, many people tend to think of school as being the time when you learn to read and write. Well, yes, you do that, but the most important things you do at school are to learn how to get on with kids of the same age as you, to learn how to play cooperatively, to manage competitive sorts of things, to manage difficult peer group interactions, to manage to be a little more separate from your parents, to be able to kind of problem solve when your mum and dad aren't there to do it for you. So all of that's going on, and I think there are some very specific challenges like teasing and bullying, which we increasingly are aware can be associated with young people becoming depressed as they get older. So all of those things are kind of normal. Let's have a look and see, are there any studies of specific behaviour problems with kids with CF? And when people have questioned, asked parents, they've said, well, 50% of them don't sleep and eat very well, and 40% of them don't want to do their chest physio. That sounds pretty bad, but actually, when you look at children who don't have a chronic illness, you'll find that you ask parents of 4-year-olds and 92% of them fight, 8% don't. Very interesting. Most of them are disobedient. They all have temper tantrums. If they get a chance, they'll hurt their siblings. And you can see that half of them eat badly, hit, take, all those sorts of things. Don't play nicely, don't share. So these things are totally normal. But again, the hard thing is, if you've got a child who needs to eat 150% of anybody else's daily calorie requirement, then not eating badly, not eating particularly well as a preschooler is much more loaded for you as a parent. I think the issues that arise, when people have looked at school-age kids at primary school is that often the issues of being different, being teased, our tendency as parents always to protect our kids, and that can end up sometimes also interfering with the normal things they've got to do. We end up seeing some increased rates of anxiety and the no behaviour in school-age kids. And what you find, again, is that when you look at our kids doing their physio, are they taking their enzymes, that you get kind of kids starting to drop out as they're less under parental control at school. And when you look at adolescents, again, for adolescents with CF, the good news is they're doing less in the way of risky behaviours than your average adolescent. So they're smoking less, they're drinking less, they're, out doing the stuff that makes your parental hair stand on end less than other kids. And the vast majority of teenagers with cystic fibrosis have very positive reports of their quality of life. So, their doctors might be going, oh, this is what the chest index score is, but actually they are reporting that their life is really good. But what you find is that the CF treatment adherence is dropping as well. So 50% are doing less than the recommended treatments and 30% are not doing anything. So that, of course, makes everyone's hair stand on end. So in thinking about what might be useful to talk about, I thought it was probably useful to look at the things that are known to help all children to be resilient, because there isn't anything specific for kids with CF. So what do we know generally about kids that helps them manage and be emotionally resilient as they're growing up, and think about how this might apply to kids with CF. And then look at some of the strategies that parents can use to manage anxiety in their kids or oppositional behaviour, and have a think about how that might apply for kids with CF. So when we look at the things that have been shown to influence emotional health for kids, I guess there's a number of things, and I'll go through each of these. So what you're born with, your biology and your temperament, the family environment, what's going on in the family, what's going on for parents as a couple, individually, our relationship with our kids, how we manage difficult behaviour in our kids, how we manage anxiety in our kids, and some things called stress inoculation and school, which we'll talk about in a minute. So when we talk about temperament, how many of you have got more than one child? And you would presume that you've parented them all in the same way. Have your kids turned out the same? No. So there's no doubt that when we kind of talk about parenting, kids bring their own little recipe, their own kind of internal behavioural style to the mix. And our eventual personality is really determined by that kind of bit that we were born with, and then that interaction with what comes along in our environment. So our parents, our siblings, what else is happening, external events. And we know that when people have looked at infants, then you'll find that, nearly half of them are easygoing babies. These are the ones that you could drive a 10-tonne truck through their room at night and they'd kind of roll over and go back to sleep. And then about 10% of them are really much more difficult to parent. They're the kids who even taking a singlet off over their head has them sort of upset, and a bath is a major disaster, a nappy change is a major disaster, let alone having to have blood tests or an IV inserted, those sorts of things. So they're kids who are much more irregular, they withdraw from new things, they take quite a long time to adapt. And then there's a sort of slightly larger group of kids who are very cautious. We call them slow to warm up. They're sort of quite anxious with new things, but eventually once they're settled in, they'll settle down and they'll be fine. So there's not a great deal that we can do about temperament, but I think when you've got a child who's temperamentally challenging, it does require all of your parental calmness to actually manage them, because these kids are harder to parent and they are harder to kind of get into a more stable state. If we next look at the family environment, what happens for parents and couples, as you all know, enormous stress on parents. You face diagnosis of your child's cystic fibrosis, genetic counselling, enormous uncertainty, time-consuming CF cares. And all of the studies that have looked at parental emotional health show that immediately after the diagnosis, your rates of depression rise and then settle. But as kids get older, we find higher rates of anxiety and depression in parents. Now, anxiety and depression are really common in the community anyway. So 1 in 10 adults will have a depressive illness at some stage. But if you look at the parents of kids with chronic illnesses, then the stress is higher. And I always think, sometimes parents will say to me, well, if they've become depressed, I feel like a failure because, I've got to manage my child's illness, it's my child who's having to do this, and then I've gotten depressed. And I guess my way of seeing it is to say, look, if you walked out on the street in front of here, and it's very common in Auckland, and you got hit by a bus, you'd end up with fractures, you might end up with internal injuries. Everyone would go, wow, no wonder you end up with a fracture, you got hit by a bus. But no one would say, oh, well, you shouldn't have got that fracture and you don't deserve treatment because we understand why you've got these fractures, you've been hit by a bus. So having a diagnosis and having the cares of cystic fibrosis are a bit like being hit by a bus. And we know that some of you, as a result of being hit by that bus called CF, will become more anxious or more depressed. Why does this matter for our children's emotional health? Well, we do know from big studies of all sorts of parents and kids that when parents have untreated anxiety and depression, then kids struggle more to cope. So if you've got anxiety and depression and you're not getting treated, then your kids find it harder too. And there are a number of reasons for this. One is that kids do model, their most important model is you. So the most important person that they make decisions about, is this safe, is this not, is this something I should be really scared of, is this not, is you as the parent. So if you're very anxious, your child's more likely to view new things or treatments with anxiety. The next thing is that when you're depressed, often you're not sleeping well, you're not eating well, you're not enjoying anything. People often think about depression being low mood, but they often don't realise that when we're depressed, we get really irritable and grumpy. So it's actually very hard to have positive interactions with your kids when you're depressed, and very hard when you're sort of feeling hopeless about everything. And finally, some really interesting research that if parents, as kind of part of all that, are sort of blaming themselves for their child's illness, then kids are not going to do so well. So some of you will have flown to come here and you get the little air hostess talk at the beginning, or the air steward talk around, should an oxygen mask descend from the, from the roof in the aircraft, put your own mask on first so your hands are free to deal to your child. And it's exactly the same for parents who are managing a chronic illness in their child, that if you're not taking good care of your health, your hands won't be free to take good care of your child. So what are the things that have been shown to be helpful for parents? Having someone you can talk freely to, someone that you can talk to about what's going on who won't give you unwanted advice. So when you want to have a good kind of grumble about something, or you're really upset about something, and you're talking to someone and they go, oh, well, I think you should have done this, or why didn't you think of that? You actually just want to kind of slap them, really. So when I say someone you can talk to freely, they've got to be someone whose main job is that they're a really good listener, because the process of being able to talk through stuff we find difficult helps us to sort it out. There's lots of research about that. Make sure that other people amongst your family circle and your friends can do your child's CF cares, because actually it's undoable if you're the only person who can do it. So it's really important that other people learn to do it, and it's really important that your child learns that other people can do it safely. So that's really important. And if you are significantly anxious or depressed, so that it's making it hard to function during the day, go to your GP. There are very, very, very effective treatments. When we look at parental relationships, again, this is something that gets squeezed out very often when kids have a serious illness. And it, again, is really important to make time to communicate. So when we look at the things that help for this, that then helps kids' emotional well-being, parents making sure that they have catch-up time. And it's a bit like the friend who listens. During the catch-up time, it's not going to go well if when you're telling your partner about your really frustrating day, they're going, well, why didn't you do such and such? Well, you shouldn't have let them get away with that. Why didn't you tell the hospital, blah, blah, blah. So, again, what you want during that catch-up time is that you have 5 minutes each and your partner just listens. No eye-rolling, no gratuitous sighs or, whatever, those sorts of things. So active listening, so that you at least keep in touch with each other and actually understand what's happening. Making sure that if you can, you get some shared activities. Often it's mums who do most of the cares. The reality is when kids have a chronic illness that one parent often has to give up outside paid employment, and that's more likely statistically to be mums than dads. And if kids get used to doing their CF cares with one parent, then they can start to go, I don't want dad to do it because he's not as good as you, mum. He hurts me. So it is really important that you both share it. It's really important that you can both do it, even if you're not doing it at the same frequency. If you're in conflict, you must get help. There are a number of ways to get this. A lot of GP practices have counsellors, and in New Zealand, I'm not sure what's available in Australia, there are relationship services that provide counselling with sliding scale. Now, why is this so important? One of the strongest predictors of child emotional problems is parental acrimony and conflict. So often people think that the thing that's damaging for kids is separation and divorce. It's actually not that. I mean, no kid likes their parents to separate or divorce, But the thing that's really damaging for kids is hearing their parents argue, hearing really nasty things said about the other parent by one parent. So it's not the divorce and separation, it's the conflict and arguing before and after separation. And with parents who stay together for the children, then if they're still arguing and there's lots of conflict, that is very emotionally damaging for kids. So I think, again, we tend to kind of take it for granted and think, oh, well, it will roll over. But there are little people sitting there listening to this and feeling incredibly frightened and very torn in it. So I think it's very important to take couple conflict really, really seriously. I did see a wonderful cartoon some years ago, which I've lost, and I keep looking for it, but it was of a very elderly couple going to their lawyer. It was a divorce lawyer, so they were sort of people in their 90s, and the lawyer said, "Why now?" And the couple said, "Well, we wanted to wait till the children were dead." And you know, I think often we have all sorts of reasons for, you know, parents staying together, you know, wait till the kids leave home, or wait for this or that. Actually, if things are really terrible, just remember that it's not the separation but the conflict that is damaging for your child. And the first step is to try and actually get some really good help for the conflict. There are plenty of reasons why parents of kids with chronic illnesses might experience more conflict, but also a lot of evidence that shows that parents often have very strong bonds and discover very, very wonderful ways of working together. The other thing is that warm family relationships. So this is kind of people enjoying each other's company, and you know, that doesn't mean you're not allowed the odd time when things don't go well. I can remember I've got 4 kids, and I can remember one of my kids saying to me one day in the midst of some, you know, dire domestic conflict, "Do you shout at your patients like this?" And I sort of was taken up, and then I said, "Well, they're my patients and you're my children." So I don't think they were terribly impressed, but it did make me sort of think, why am I shouting at my kids? It's actually not very helpful. So warm family relationships are not just the kind of feel-good thing, but it makes kids feel good about themselves. So that's really important too, and that's very protective when kids are facing negative things. So with some of the very recent research looking at the impact of bullying for kids in primary school, what they've found is that kids who have a warm relationship with their parents and the family have warm relationships with each other, lots of sharing, people saying positive things to each other, that those kids are much less likely to become depressed and miserable down the track as a result of that bullying. So it's not just what's happening in the home, but having those sorts of positive family relationships makes a difference for kids when they're facing other adversity. Now when we look, this is a slightly sort of daunting slide, but when we look at the domains of parenting, then I guess we can look at whether parents are accepting and warm and responsive to their kids or rejecting and cold and unresponsive. And then there are the domains of, do you expect your kids to do what you tell them to do? And do you keep control over what's happening in their lives? Big picture, you know where they are, you know what they should be doing, you know who they should be playing with at any one time. Or do you not have any expectation that they'll be compliant with what you ask them to do, and you don't sort of keep a very good control over what's happening? And what's come out very clearly in all of the literature is that it's the parents who are warm and responsive to their kids, but also have expectations that kids will do what they're asked to. So we call that authoritative parenting that has the best outcomes for kids emotionally and behaviourally. That if you're demanding and controlling and you're rejecting and unresponsive, which none of you are because you're sitting here, you're caring about what happens to your kids, then we call that authoritarian, and kids will be compliant, but they're often very miserable. If you're lovely, warm, accepting and responsive, and actually you don't expect your kids to do anything, then that's kind of indulgent parenting, and kids often feel quite insecure with that. They don't know what the rules are, they don't know what's going to happen. So I think one of the things that sometimes happens within extended families when a child has a life-threatening illness is that people go, oh, poor them, we won't insist on something because they're sick. But actually kids feel much more secure if we are being demanding about what we expect of them. And if parents are rejecting and unresponsive and they're also undemanding, then we call that neglect. So it's sometimes hard to feel close to kids. I think parents will often say that they find some kids in their family easier to kind of get close to, and some kids in the family might be harder to get close to. And there are a whole lot of reasons for that. Sometimes, we have our own style of doing things, and if we have a child who's not a particularly good temperamental fit, if you've got a child who's completely laissez-faire and messy and all over the place, and you're someone who likes order and routines, then that can be hard. If we've experienced really negative things early in kids' lives, so parents will talk about things like serious family illness or having a really distressing marital breakup early in a child's life or during the pregnancy or death of a parent, then that can also make it difficult. And I think also having to do lots of stuff where your child's not very happy about you doing it can make it tough. So what are the things that have been shown to help build positive relationships? And I think one is shared activities, and in busy lives that's often hard to do, but certainly families who eat at the meal table together, there are a whole lot of associations of better emotional health for kids whose whole family sits down to eat together. Families who do some shared activities rather than everyone in their own room watching their own television or playing on their own PlayStation or iPad, that is also better for kids. And making time for what we call child-led play. Now, if you were to ask me when my kids were younger, did I have quality time with my kids, I'd say, sure, I had quality time with my children. But when I think honestly back about it, I think some of that time I was trying to get them to do educational things that I thought would be good for them. Some of that time, teach your child to read and rah. Some of that time I was exhausted and I was kind of playing with them, but I was mentally checking off what I needed to do the next day or trying to sneakily read the paper at the same time as I was having a quality interaction with them. So I think when people have looked at what is helpful for children, then actually having really small bits of time during the day regularly in which you let your child lead the play is a very positive thing for kids, and it really builds a very positive relationship. And that's very important when you're then wanting to get your child to do things that they find difficult. It's kind of like you've got emotional money in the bank. You've got a bit of kind of bargaining power because you've built that relationship up. So the sorts of things that have been helpful is to say, busy lives, let's just talk about 5 minutes. 5 minutes doesn't sound like much, can be hard to find in a busy day, but 5 minutes is all that it takes. And it's very important that you don't choose an activity that doesn't allow you to interact. So board games are usually disaster because they take hours, and kids usually don't like losing, so they're not going to feel very positive about it, and you have to get really creative at cheating so that you lose at snakes and ladders, so it's very difficult. But looking at construction things, so Lego, Duplo, those sorts of things, drawing, playing with dolls' houses, playing with pots, playing with anything. Having the 5 minutes, and during that time, your role is just to follow your child's lead. So you give them lots of positive attention, encouragement and praise. You reflect what they're saying. So if the child says, I'm now going to drive my big truck under the sofa, you go, wow, you're driving your big truck under the sofa. You describe what your child's doing because that helps kids to know that you're really engaged with what they're doing. And you give them very specific praise. So you're really just following their lead, reflecting what they're doing, echoing what they're doing, imitating what they're doing, and giving them very specific praise. So not, that's wonderful, but gee, you're doing a fantastic job of piling those blocks together to make a building. Well done. Now, the things that are really hard for us not to do as adults are questions. Because when we're with our kids and they're playing, often we're going, oh, what are you doing there? Oh, who's that you're drawing? Oh, what are you going to do with that? What's that? And what that does is it means the child has to interrupt their play to actually answer it. So it breaks the chain of it. So the really hard thing in those 5 minutes, and I don't know anyone, including health professionals, who hasn't found this really hard to do, is to not ask questions during that 5 minutes. To just follow their lead. And the other thing that's really hard to do, and that you don't correct, if they're doing something and they're colouring with a red pen and actually they're calling it blue, you don't take any notice of that. You just say, gosh, you're doing really wonderful colouring with the blue pen. But you don't go, no, you've got that wrong. It's not a red pen, it's a blue pen. Or, no, that's not the way to fit that together. Now, the other hard thing is, on the days when things have turned to custard and it's really bad, you still do the special playtime. So this is not instruction time, and it's not contingent on whether they've been good or not. This is when we build the goodies in the bank that help us to get through bad days. So special playtime happens whether it's a good day or a bad day, or whether you're sort of thinking really it would have been much easier to have a puppy than have a child, which every parent has, What about managing difficult behaviour? And I think there are a number of things. Probably the first most important thing is that in managing difficult behaviour, you are 10 million miles ahead if you're having good times with your child as well. And you have to work very hard at that if you've got a child who's naturally oppositional, one of those no, no and no kids where everything you ask or instruct them to do, they say no. So managing difficult behaviour, there are a number of sort of basic things here. And again, I expect this will be really familiar to most of you. But it is important that kids know what the rules are. It's important for all of us. If you start a new job and you're not sure what the rules are, then you get kind of anxious and antsy. And if someone says, well, actually that's not where you put things, you start to feel kind of, well, no one told me and I didn't understand that. So it is really important that we're very, very clear about the basic rules. We don't have too many rules, but the rules that are there are really explicit. And we're really clear about what will happen if you break those rules. I'll go through all of these: environmental management, positive reinforcement and attention for good behaviours, selective ignoring, very hard to do, really important, and time out, which is the thing we should use the least. Environmental management is our real friend, and this is what we use with little kids when they're kind of fiddling with delicate stuff. You put it on a high shelf, or you put barriers, or we have fences around pools. So little kids who can't understand the importance of some of the things we're asking them to do, we have physical barriers, so we look at environmental management. Don't try and do the tough stuff when kids are really tired. So parents will often say, try and think about when's the best time to do something that a child finds hard. And that's difficult when you've got a child with a chronic illness, because sometimes the tough stuff has to be done. But I guess it's things like not playing a wonderful game of hide and seek rumpering around the house just before they go to bed, because that's just going to make everything go bad. So trying to think around what are the windows where my child's most likely to be able to do things, and how do I rearrange the day? Keeping kids busy with lots to do makes a real difference. So often when our kids are being difficult, in fact they're a bit bored or there's not much to do. And there's fantastic research that shows if kids are kind of aggressive and antsy and getting into fights, giving them physical exercise really helps. And you'll often find that with little kids. If you say, go outside and bounce on the trampoline, when they come back in, they'll have settled right down. So there's really good research to show that if kids are getting aggressive, getting them to do some physical exercise really helps. Now, the most important behavioural mechanism we have is giving praise and positive reinforcement for the things we want our kids to do. And I think all of you will be working either in paid employment or in the house. How often does anyone tell you that you're doing a great job and compliment you for what you're doing in your everyday work? Once a day? 10 times a day? If you had to think about the balance of positive comments about what you're doing to criticisms or negatives, which would be the higher? Would it be the positive comments or the criticisms? Criticisms, okay. So the people you work with haven't read their stuff. They don't know what's important. To actually change behaviour most effectively, it doesn't involve punishment, it involves increasing the positive reinforcement, and that's mostly just praise and commenting on it. Saying, well done, gosh, you did a fantastic job at that, I really like the way you did X, Y and Z. Increasing it, and you need to get a ratio of 10 positive comments to 1 critical one. That's really hard to do, but it's very effective. So you can tell your workmates and your family that too, that if they want you to do things differently, they really need to praise the stuff that you're doing well. Much more effective. And you know, sometimes families will say to me, well, isn't that bribery? Well, I love my job, but you know, if they stopped paying me, I probably wouldn't keep going. And that's not bribery, that's just a reward and acknowledgement of what I do. And I'm much more likely to go to work, you know, feeling cheerful if my teammates go, oh gosh, thank you, or, oh, you know, you did a good job with us. So immediate attention and praise for good behaviour is the most effective tool we've got for changing kids' behaviour. Catch them when they're good. Any attention is rewarding. So if the only attention you're giving your child is when they're doing something hideous, that will be rewarding for them. So you've got to actually try and move it around so that you give much more attention for the things that they're doing well. And if they're doing things that are heinous or bad, or you think, I don't want them to do that, what you've got to think is, well, what's the opposite of that? If a child is bouncing on the sofa, rather than going, don't bounce on the sofa, get off the sofa, think, well, what's the thing I want them to do? I want them to sit on their bottom on the sofa. And the first time you see them do it, go, wow, that's fantastic. That's a really lovely way you're sitting on the sofa. So make sure the praise is specific, because if you say fantastic, kids don't know what's fantastic. Is it the way I did my hair, or is it you know, the way I'm behaving, or is it actually that I gave my sister as a kick as I walked past and my parents didn't see it but I thought they did, and they think that's fantastic. So you have to be really clear with kids what it is that you're praising. Now the next thing you've got to do is planned ignoring, and this requires all of your dramatic talents, because to ignore difficult behaviour is, you know, kind of chews you up inside. It's really, really, really difficult to do. You can only use it for behaviours that are not dangerous. So obviously if a child's about to jump off the garage roof or they're hitting or biting, you can't use that. But you can use it for things where you've got a little bit of leeway. And in fact, if you're looking at battles over physio and enzymes, you do have some leeway there. We know kids are not doing particularly well at this often. So often, instead of getting into big fights with them, using planned ignoring for the sorts of behaviours, and this will often be saying no, whinging, whining, I don't like that, I'm not going to do it, it's boring, those sorts of things. It's turning away, stopping interacting, talking to someone else in the family and just ignoring the child. And it just has to be for a short period of time. Kids are very sensitive to that. They hate you kind of stopping having that wonderful fight with them. They really, really don't like it. They'll often kind of try and manoeuvre themselves into your visual framework so that they can carry the fight, because it's your engagement and it's very rewarding for them. As soon as your child stops the difficult behaviour, be absolutely ready. So instead of going, oh, thank God you've stopped doing that, which is always my first instinct, it's to sort of go, gee, I love it when you use your quiet voice. So, you know, the examples I've got there, if we look at how we might do that with kids who've got, you know, if you're trying to get them to do physio and they're jumping around and you're trying to do it using planned ignoring, just turning slightly away, stopping speaking, immediately that they stop jumping around and sit down, give praise. Wow, good work sitting quietly. You know, we can get through this quickly and go and do something nice. So stopping the big battle around, sit down, you know, I'm counting to 3, actually just withdrawing your attention. There is actually the one area where there's some good research is around eating with kids with cystic fibrosis, because it's such a loaded issue. You need your kids to eat, they need to be well nourished, that really helps their lung function. And there's some really interesting research videotaping parents and kids with CF at the dinner table. And what it finds is what we know with all parents, that we spend much more time and attention and interaction with our kids when they're showing non-eating behaviours, and when they actually take a mouthful, we ignore it. So to change the eating, what you've got to do is really shift all of your attention to praise, very specific praise, when they are eating, when they're putting food in their mouth, when they're chewing it and swallowing it. Now this is very hard for parents to do. It sounds really simple, but it's hard to do, because you've got to manage your own frustration and you've got to be patient. But again, being ready to praise. So if you think about the things we do, we spend hours going, open wide, woo. Nothing happens. So it's really having all of our interactive attention ready for the moment when they do put something in their mouths, and doing lots of just looking the other way, talking to someone else when they're doing other stuff. Sometimes when a child has, several behaviours that you find difficult to do, it's really important not to try and change everything at once. If someone decided that I should get fitter than I am, I'm kind of a bit fit but not very fit, if they had this big exercise program, there's no way I'd be able to do it because I'm just not like that. But if they said, well, Louise, you do walk up 2 flights of stairs in the hospital during the day, perhaps you could make it 3 flights. My rule is I'll walk 2 flights, but I won't walk 7 flights. But if someone said walk 7 flights, I'd go, no, can't do that. But if they said, why don't you make it 3 flights of stairs, I could do it. So it's really important to set small achievable goals and not try and change everything at once. Be very clear about what you're wanting to change. Find positive rewards for your child, and this should not be bank-breaking stuff. Your attention is the most rewarding thing. Just remember that all of the time. Little kids need immediate rewards. They can't wait for next month to get their rewards. They need it to be now. And it is really important to start with what we call almost good behaviours. So kids don't learn to do tough stuff straight away. I've just got a little thing there about time out. I think people often struggle with time out, and in fact, when you turn away from your child and ignore them, that's a form of time out. You've stopped giving them the wonderful reinforcement of your interaction. So when you turn away from them, that's a form of time out. But it is really important to use it for behaviours that you can't use planned ignoring for. Being very clear about the rules, safe place to go, 1 minute per year of age, fresh start when they come out, no scolding or postmortems. No, why did you bite your brother? It makes mummy really unhappy. Just fresh start. But focus on frequent praise. So I love the way you're sharing your toys with your sister, those sorts of things. With older kids, you can use more non-verbal, cool high fives. Often older kids are much more interested in earning points or earning rewards, but it's very important to be consistent with this. So both parents need to be on the same page. It's going to really undermine it if one of you is being very careful and then the other parent takes the child out shopping and just buys it for them anyway. So there are a whole range of ways we can do that with older kids. Restriction of privileges, natural and logical consequences. If you don't get ready in time for the birthday party, then you are going to arrive late at that. But still remember, you need a 10-to-1 positive reinforcement or positive praise to the one critical one. What about anxiety? And there are lots and lots of different sorts of anxiety kids can have. Kids can find it difficult separating from you to go to school or to bed or to overnight sleepovers. Some kids worry about everything, so there'll be a rash of kids worrying about earthquakes because we've had an earthquake in Wellington, volcanoes, tsunami, absolutely everything. Kids who are worry-warts. Many kids who have a lot to do with hospitals worry about needles. They develop a needle phobia with the experience they have. Some kids worry about social interactions, and some kids can have panicky feelings. It doesn't matter what sort of anxiety it is, it's the main sorts of principles that are helpful. And just remember that some anxiety is really useful. You don't want to have no anxiety. Anxiety is what makes you check that you've got your parachute on if you're going skydiving. So people who have no anxiety are not very safe people. So it's a bit like the Goldilocks and the three bears. You want a bit of anxiety, but not too much and not too little. And anxiety really only becomes a problem when it stops us from doing things we want or need to do. So kids can feel anxious, but if it doesn't stop them from doing the things they need to do, then we wouldn't worry so much about it. Anxiety has 2 components, and one is the thinking part of it, and the other is the physical part of it. So for many people, when they get anxious, what that does is trigger all of that flight or fright response where you pour out adrenaline, your heart goes fast, you start to breathe fast, you feel shaky, you feel sick, you get pins and needles, those sorts of things. And our usual instinctive response is to avoid the thing that's making us anxious. So we think, I don't really like flying on planes, I didn't really want to go to that conference, or maybe I'll drive down to Invercargill or something like that. So, you know, we all develop sort of ways of avoiding things, and that's often the thing that's disabling for kids. So if they're anxious about blood tests and they avoid having their annual review, then that's going to be a problem. If they're anxious about school and they start refusing to go to school because they're avoiding it, it makes them anxious, that's going to be a problem. So what are the things that are helpful for a kid who's got a bit of anxiety? And one is understanding about it, what the symptoms are, and the other is doing the things that make you anxious, starting little and building up. So knowing that if you do that, you will get the anxious feelings, the racing heart, the breathing, the kind of churning stomach, but that those symptoms will settle down as you keep doing the thing that makes you anxious. And using your problem solving and calm breathing. I think there are lots of things that we do as parents, sort of intuitively, that actually aren't helpful for kids who are anxious. So I thought it was useful to have a look at those, because our first instinct is to keep reassuring our child. And in fact, doing lots of reassuring isn't helpful for anxious kids. It actually rewards their anxious talk and behaviour with positive attention, and it strengthens their belief that what they're anxious about is very scary. So if you pay lots of attention to it, I'm not saying you have to ignore it, obviously not, but if you, every time they go, oh, I'm really worried about this, you go, oh yes, it's terrible, then that actually reinforces that anxiety behaviour. Also, stepping in and solving every problem for your child is not helpful. So it stops your child from thinking that they can sort things out for themselves. Allowing your child, the third thing, allowing them to avoid things that make them anxious is also not helpful. So letting them avoid, because all that makes it is even harder the next time round. And finally, and this is very easy to do, when we get sick and tired of sort of trying to manage an anxious child, we can get impatient, and that makes kids more anxious. So what are the things we can do that actually help our kids? And one is, again, thinking about that positive reinforcement, really looking for any little example of them being brave and commenting, going, wow, you've done a fantastic job of going and saying hello to that new kid who came round to the house. Or I'm really proud of the way that even though you were crying, you held your finger still for the blood test. That's fantastic. Ignoring behaviours you don't want. So stopping, using that planned ignoring. So if a child's going, I know it's going to be terrible, it's going to be absolutely awful, I will never manage this blood test, actually just tuning out on that and talking about other things. Prompting your child to cope constructively, so getting them to problem solve, get their detective out. What are the solutions? I'm worried at school because so-and-so's invited, my best friend to a party and they haven't invited me. What can I do? So getting them to do some kind of problem solving about what might be helpful. And generally, anxiety runs in families a bit. So, we all come from the same genetic things. So if you're someone who's very anxious and when your child has to have blood tests, you go, oh no, this is terrible, oh dear, I hope it won't hurt too much, then your child's going to be really anxious too. So you need to do your kind of work on anxiety because you're the main model that your child sees. We're going to run out of time, so I might try and save this for the end, but it's really useful to learn to relax. In fact, I will take you through this because I'm happy to put this up on a website so people can. Very useful to learn to relax. So just in 1 minute, get yourselves comfortable, just sitting comfortably. I want you to start with tightening the muscles in your toes and then let them go loose. And as the muscles in your toes go loose, just feel your feet feeling nice and kind of comfortable and warm. Then I want you to tighten the muscles around your knees and thighs. Clench them tight and then let them go loose. So now both your legs and your feet are just feeling nice and comfy. Next, I want you to make a fist with your hands. Tight, tight, tight. And then let them go loose. So that your fingers feel kind of a little bit floaty. Pull your shoulders up to your ears. And then just let them flop. So now your arms and your shoulders and your hands are just hanging really loose. Now screw up your face, clench your teeth, tight, 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 and then loose. So you can feel your eyeballs are relaxed and your jaws relaxed. And finally, I want you to focus on breathing into your tummy using your diaphragm. You all know what diaphragms are. Most people don't. Taking slow breaths into your tummy. And breathe out slowly. And as you breathe out, imagine that you're just starting to feel more comfortable, more relaxed. You can feel all of the tension flowing out. And imagine that you're somewhere peaceful and relaxing, somewhere nice. Might be warm, might be a beach, might be just lying on the sofa at home, might be sitting in your garden. So really quick relaxation. Useful to do with your kids as well. Problem solving is also a really helpful thing for kids. You know, relax first, identify the problem and describe it, brainstorm and think of all the possible solutions. And really important to do this with kids. There are no bad suggestions. So as your kid's brainstorming things, you know, if they're having problems with another kid at school and they go, well, I could punch him, don't go, oh, no, don't do that. Say, yep, well, that's one of the things you could do. Let's write it up on the board, because what you're next going to do is write down the pros and cons of each solution. So no bad suggestions, put all suggestions up and then go and look at the pros and cons, because that's when punching the other kid at school, what are the good things about that? Well, might feel good. What are the bad things? Probably get a detention. So that's how kids sort out the pros and cons. Then decide which one you're going to do and trial it and evaluate it. You might have to go back and trial another solution. So simple problem solving, you can do that with little kids. Really important to do. I've got there some useful websites. I think that book on helping your anxious child's a really useful one, and that Anxiety BC website I've found really useful. Lovely handouts for parents. I use them a lot with kids and parents, so good stuff to use. Got 5 minutes? 2 minutes, okay. Just another couple of things. Not all negative experiences are bad for you. So in the same way as when your child has their immunisations, they get a tiny dose of a weakened or a killed bacteria and that, or virus, and that's what prompts their body to sort of put up a good fight. Little brief exposures to negative experiences can help kids to develop coping strategies. And I think when your child has an illness that requires them to have lots and lots of stuff, it's very easy to think, I've got to fix everything for them. I've got to problem solve and protect them from everything. But just remember that kids learn things through being exposed to tough stuff, as long as it's not overwhelming tough stuff and as long as they've got good supports. So an example of this is that children who learn to actually go to someone else's place to play or to have an overnight with grandparents or with a friend actually cope better when they come into hospital. So just remembering that stress inoculations can be... and the final thing I'll put is managing school. I think there are lots of things that can happen for kids at school, and often the challenge is sorting out what are the things that I need to do as a parent, what do I need to interfere with, and what don't I need to interfere with. And the two really important things for kids are building relationships with other kids, because that helps with their identity and their competence, and also experiencing success in some domain. You don't have to be a rocket scientist and you don't have to be a fantastic pitcher, but being able to have some task or something that you do at school that you experience some success in. It might be being the library monitor or helping the PE teacher take stuff out, that you've got something you've got responsibility for, that you have to do some problem solving for, is really, really important. So finally, just what I wanted to say was, you know, most of your kids are doing well. If you think your child has got any difficulties that are making it really tough for them, more than the sort of day-to-day stuff that we've been talking about, it is really important to get help. And so these are the sources that you can go to. GPs, your CF team will always know, local child and adolescent mental health services, and often schools have supports for kids as well. But do remember that your kids are overall doing well. I'm really sorry we've run out of time, but I'm happy to take questions in the speaker corner afterwards.
Can I just stay here for 2 seconds?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Thank you very much, Louise. And in the spirit of 10 positive things to everyone, your first positive one is you're all very attentive. You've got 9 more to collect for the rest of the day. There were some fantastic messages for all of us there, and I think a couple that I particularly took is that reinforcing that every child is born with a different temperament. And I have 2 children. When my first son was born 13 years ago, a midwife looked at him and said, "He's a wise old soul that's been here before." And I thought, he's only 24 hours old, what a lot of rubbish, how's she going to know? She knew. 18 months later, she said to me when my daughter was born, "This one hasn't been here before." Boy, is she right. Thank you also for reminding us that we need to look after ourselves. I think as parents, that's one thing we tend to overlook. And if you're looking after a child who has cystic fibrosis or any chronic illness, you can forget about the most important person, and that is you. So please take that message home with you.